You're listening to the Belly Dance Geek Clubhouse at bellydancegeek.com. Hi, everybody. This is Nadira Jamal, and welcome to the Belly Dance Geek Clubhouse. The Clubhouse is a place where dancers can get together and geek out on all of that stuff that's hard to get in classes and on DVDs. It's really easy to find help with the what, so things like moves and choreographies and combinations, but it's a lot harder to get information on the how and the why, so things like composition and dance principles, improvisation, culture, musicality, history. And so every month I'm going to interview a different guest expert on a different topic. And we'll always have time for question and answers so you can geek out too. So if you think that knowledge and creativity go together like chocolate and peanut butter, you are in the right place. So my guest today is Aegela, and originally from Atlanta, Georgia, she's now residing in Toledo, Ohio. Aegela has been actively involved in Middle Eastern dance for 35 years. She teaches multi-level classes weekly and seminars throughout the U.S., and has developed dance programs for the visually impaired, the hearing impaired, and for use with occupational therapy programs. Aegela was the first non-Arab to dance in Alexandria, Egypt, and was awarded with a lifetime performer's license by the Egyptian Ministry of Culture. She studied extensively with legendary Egyptian dancer and choreographer Mahmoud Reda, and now with his blessing and encouragement is conducting seminars on the Reda technique. So welcome, Aegela.
Hi, Nadira. Thank you. I'm excited. I'm nervous. Be kind to me.
We all will be.
Thank you for having me there.
Thank you so much for coming.
Oh, I'm so excited about talking about him.
Yeah. So some of our listeners know Reda's work very well, and some may not know anything about him. So can you tell us who he is?
Mahmoud Reda is probably one of the greatest treasures of Egypt, outside the pyramids and the Sphinx and other natural wonders. He has been called the father of folkloric dance, but that's not a term that he really cares to wear. But he was an amazing choreographer and dancer who began in the 1950s and formed a troupe that actually brought a dance identity to Egypt. He created, along with Reda Fahmy, his dance partner, the Reda Troupe, and you could think of Reda and Mahmoud as like the Fred Astaire and Ginger Rogers of Middle Eastern dance, if you would. So he actually fused a number of styles together, and interestingly, his technique was based on a lot of things that he was seeing in the Western films from Hollywood in 1940s and 50s. So this is Mahmoud the treasure in a nutshell.
Mm-hmm. And how did he get started in dance?
Well, let me give you a little bit of background on him. He was born, he has a birthday coming up next month. He was born March 18th, 1930 in Cairo, number 8 out of a string of 10 kids in a middle-class family. And his father was head librarian of the Cairo University. And he had an older brother, Ali, whom many of you may know of as a composer, but Ali was also a very accomplished dancer of the popular forms swing and jitterbug that were sweeping through Cairo in the 50s. Moody, I call him Moody, no disrespect, just a nickname, but Moody was a huge fan of Gene Kelly and Fred Astaire and a third person, Mickey Mouse. So during the 40s and 50s, Egypt was very fascinated with what was going on in Western films, with the grandeur of it, the costuming, and even in the nightclubs in Cairo, they started emulating these floor shows, these grand, almost Rita Hayworth comes down the staircase type showcases in their nightclubs. But Moody would go every Saturday he spent at the theater watching these movies of Gene Kelly and Fred Astaire and Mickey Mouse. And then at the end of the day, he would kind of slip into a side street and practice these routines that he had seen Mr. Kelly or Mr. Astaire doing. So he was so enamored of this, in fact, that he was kind of thrown out of school one day for this. He he was in class, and the teacher left the room, and he jumped up on the teacher's desk, and he begins to reenact Singing in the Rain. And he was busted. The teacher came back in and threw him out of school that day and said that he was a lazy Egyptian who would make nothing of himself. So there's your education system at work, really. But anyway, he went on to graduate from high school and then from the School of Political Economics at Cairo University. And he later, he was always interested in dance from these movies, but he also represented Egypt in 1952 at the Olympics, the Summer Olympics in Helsinki, as a gymnast. And his specialty was floor exercise, or free exercise it was called. And a little-known fact is that he was the very first competitor to include dance steps in his free exercise routine in the Olympics.
And now it's the standard.
And now it's a standard, yes, it is. And so Moody, after he graduated, from college, he took a job with Shell Oil Company as an accountant, but of his own admission, he was a terrible accountant. But he had to pay for his interest in dance, and how many of us have been that road? You know, if we had our preference, we'd be dancing all the time, but something has to pay the bills, you know?
Right.
And he went to work with an Argentine dance company, and because this is all that was available to Egypt at that time, this is in the early 50s, you know, they were seeing other countries bring their art forms to Egypt. But a couple of things were going on. It was not really affordable for the people to come to the theater, for the Egyptian people to go to the theater to see these. And also what they were seeing were Lido-type reviews of dance companies. And what he really wanted to do, he said to me one day, I found myself dancing Argentine, dancing Brazilian, and why was I not dancing Egypt? You know? So his motivation was to create some dance form that would be an identity for Egypt. And to make it
all happening in a big nationalistic period in the world worldwide, but also especially soon after Egypt's full independence, right?
That's exactly right, Nadira. Nasser was president. He led the revolution against King Farouk. And under Nasser, there was this huge move to modernize Egypt. And this is also when the Aswan Dam construction was begun under his reign. And this was going to do a lot for the industrial aspect of Egypt. But there was just this huge move to bring Egypt into that current century. So they were fascinated with anything Western. And they were also fascinated with having a national identity. And so it was all happening right at the same time, and it made this climate very right for this. Mahmoud married his first wife, Nadida, whose sister happened to be Farida Fahmy. And Farida, you know, became his dance partner. Nadida, sadly, they were married only a short time before her passing. She had congenital heart problems, and she was still around for the forming of the Reda Troupe. In 1957, Moody was dancing in Russia, or the Soviet Union as it was called then, and he and Farida met. She was a ballet dancer in a troupe, and they decided that they both had this burning desire to form their own company and something that would represent Egypt. Over the couple of years, Farida married Ali Reda, Moody's brother, and so sisters were married to brothers. Kind of gave that family, you know, support for the launching of the Reda Troupe in 1959. It really became a whole family affair. So I think something else that was key here to what you said is that Farida's father was a professor of industrial engineering in Egypt at Cairo University, and he was a very forward-thinking person in terms of encouraging his daughters to participate in sports, to dance, to participate in the arts. And this, again, is part of that huge move to westernize or to modernize Egypt, if you would.
Mm-hmm.
So the Reda Troupe was born. And Farida's mother handled costumings, and Nadita did design, and Ali was the business person, and Moody wrote the choreographers, and Farida was the only trained dancer in the whole batch. She was the only professionally trained dancer. Moody was a gymnast, and when you watch some of his films, his footage, you see that phenomenal athletic ability combined with a grace and rotations in the hip and rotations in the upper body that gave the particular men's performances so much style and so much power. Mm-hmm. But in the beginning, they were running on a shoestring, and haven't we all been there, as dancers?
And it seems like around the same time in a lot of other countries, you start getting national folk troupes, which are government-sponsored, sometimes government-run. And my understanding is that there were some things like that going on in Egypt as well, but that the Reda Troupe was really this independent organization. Is that right?
The Reda Troupe was totally independent. They were self-funded. Moody actually still had his job at Shell Oil, and he put together 6 girls and 6 boys, as he calls them. Not a single one of them had any dance training except for Reda. He found 12 musicians who needed work, and he paid them all out of his salary as an accountant with Shell Oil. And they made about £3 a month, which was about $1. So they were not flush with cash. And they were always, as he said, looking for a place to rehearse. They were making their own costumes. They were everyone chipping in. Does it sound like any troupe that you know of here in the U.S.?
All of them?
I've never had a dance troupe. I have a dance company. Yeah, but everything I've heard, I have a dance company, and they govern themselves, and they're really pretty awesome. But how many people in our business are funding their own way, and with their troops. In 1961, there was a recognition by the Egyptian government of the Reda Troupe, and they nationalized it. It was a good thing in that they finally had money in the budget. On the other side, they had to make a budget every year and present it to the government for approval. How much for costuming, how much for musicians, how much for rental of the space. They gave him a studio at the famous Balloon Theater in Aegela, which really is a hot air balloon for their roof. And they gave him his office that he still maintains today on Qasr El Nil in downtown Cairo. And people should know here that there is a national folkloric troupe, which is called a Kalmeya, but that is not the same thing as the Reda Troupe. So the long and short is they all became government employees. The troupe members moved up to a high rate of pay of roughly $3 a month while they were training. Yeah, I know. They got maybe $5 a month when they started performing. And then they would have had about $10 U.S. in U.S. dollars per month as government employees, but they also became eligible for pensions, and they had a paycheck. Although he still encouraged all the people in his troupe to have a day job. And I remember a long time ago when I was a baby dancer, and I went to I used to go study in Knoxville, Tennessee. I'd drive from Atlanta to Knoxville and take private classes with a girl named Shahira. And she said, the first thing I tell everybody in this business is get a job. So you're going to need one. She was so right. But all the families was still pulling together on this. And Ali Reda, his brother, had turned to filmmaking by then in 1961. And Ali produced the first film called El Agazet Nosasana, or Mid-Year Holiday, which was a vehicle for the Reda Troupe. And the storyline, it was the dance company going on this holiday. And this really, in terms of the Egyptian people, catapulted them to the forefront. They became known by the average Egyptian person. And Moody's goal was always to take this dance form to the stage and to make it affordable. So he would be the first to tell you his dances were only about 10% folklore. He said they were inspired by folklore, but really what is folklore? He said if you take traditional folkloric dancers to the stage and they are dressed in the way they would normally dress, two things occur. First, everyone is wearing black. It's not very exciting. And second, you don't see the women dancing. For instance, the Saidi women are not dancing. So he gave color to the costumes. He theatricalized everyday events like the women going to the Nile to draw water in their water jugs, or the fishermen bringing in the boats and in the afternoon, or the traditional boy chases girl, boy has to fight off 10 other suitors for girls' attention. But this was his intent. 10% folklore, he will tell you, about 90% extra attention on the dance and theater. But he was also infusing this style with ballet, with a little bit of jazz, with a little bit of all the different forms that he had seen in the Gene Kelly, Fred Astaire movies. So we were looking then at, this was the early 1960s when he was becoming more of a household name in Egypt. And people could afford to go to the theater to see him because he kept the prices reasonable. There were two other films. Ali did in 1963, which is Love at Karnak, which I think is what most people are familiar with because of the famous Khatib dance by Mahmoud. And the last film was in 1970 called The Paper Thief. So a couple of those are comedy dance type things, and one is a quasi-drama. So after just a short time later, in 1972, Moody unfortunately contracted a virus and was hospitalized for 15 days in Egypt, and he understood that this would threaten his long-term health. So he stepped down as principal dancer and continued to train and choreograph and direct the troupe, and he did it all. He did the lighting, he did the staging, he helped with the design, he, was supervising by then 150 professionals, both dancers, musicians, stage crew. But he said even at this height, he was still having to battle with the budget because the Ministry of Culture, you see, oversaw the ballet and the opera and the theater and the circus. And he says, sometimes I think I had to stand behind the lions and the bears to get my budget for my costumes. I said, yes, but you were famous, Mahmoud. He said, but tell them. Still, I was having to wait behind the bears and the lions for my budget, So he really did not come to the U.S. until 1979 with his first tour, and he came, I think Delilah had him out there, and then during the 90s, he was very actively retiring because you see by 1990, actively touring, because by 1990, he was at the mandatory retirement age of 60. And he had to step down from his government post. He had been Undersecretary of the Ministry of Culture. And then in 1990, he was retired. And he was then a little freer, actually, to travel. So, and he was writing his choreographies for workshops, began to teach a lot of workshops. But this is something I'd like for people to really understand when they're looking at maybe anything they see on YouTube about the Reda Troupe, that he was actively involved with them up until 1990. But after that, the troupe still exists, but it's mostly in name only. He's not training them. Occasionally, he was commissioned to write a choreography, for the Reda Troupe, but this was 1990 was the end of his active involvement with it. So in 2009, we went on to celebrate his 50 years in dance, and it was really so cool to Egyptian television ran a week-long special every day. They had either an interview with him or showed his movies or clips from his performances, and he loved to run. He said, okay, but we have to finish by this time so I can see myself on the news. He would leave him plenty of time to cut through all the Cairo traffic so he could get home to watch himself on the news, So, just like the rest of us.
I know. I was just thinking that's exactly what I would do. Or sit in the lobby of the TV station and watch it there.
Yes, exactly. So, and he would often, when I would go there, I'll tell you shortly how I did meet him, but when I would go there to the office or to the studio to work, and he would love to get out the medals. He got this wonderful medal from King Hussein of Jordan, and he said, and he would dig through these boxes, and he said, what do you think? Do you like it? And I said, yes, it's quite impressive. It's quite nice. He said, yes, I like the color very much. He thought it looked nice, it was good. But he, in terms of giving Egypt an identity in dance, absolutely did he do it. Yes.
Mm-hmm. I've got a question about that. So, Egypt is a very diverse place, and, how people dance traditionally, just for folk dance and fun, in one place can be very different from in another. So how did he take that diversity and bring it into a single idea of this is Egypt?
Okay. I think this was really a good question because it was one of the key elements for his success. I think if we go back and remember that Farida's father, Hassan, who was the engineering professor, was very, very adamant in his support of his daughter's endeavor in the dance and of the Reda Troupe in general. And he took some flack in society because Egypt was a very, very conservative, still is quite conservative, culture. And the fact that he stood very firm in the face of a lot of criticism over this actually gave legitimacy to the Reda Troupe. The other thing, as Moody said, he had to cater to this conservative culture. And at that time, boys and girls did not dance together on the stage. So this was very innovative, again. There was no physical contact between them. He was careful in his costuming. The girls weren't showing any midriff, They were wearing initially long-sleeve costumes and later started showing some arm. But he recognized that he was up against this modern need for conservatism, if you would. Mm-hmm. And he didn't try to change that. He tried to work within it. And I think that was very key to his success initially. And yes, you're right. If you go to different parts of Egypt, for instance, if you go to Sharm el-Sheikh, which is a resort area, you'll see a much freer attitude because Egypt depends on two things, cotton and tourism. And if the tourists come to Sharm el-Sheikh for a resort, then it's all about ensuring that they can have this more European experience. If you go to some of the villages, the smaller villages in Upper Egypt, you're not going to see the women out there dancing, even now. You know, you'll see the men dancing, of course, but you don't see the women getting out there to dance in public. So, and I have to tell you a personal story along that line. You can stop me whenever you need to, dear. But
oh, please.
Back in 2006, I had helped with a tour with Scheherazade Imports, with taking a group to Egypt, and I helped my friend Lucy on that trip. And one of our security detail, we became friends, email friends, and after I came back to the U.S., and he was very kind, very humble young man, and he was from a conservative village about an hour outside of Egypt. And he said, over the next year, he said, my family would like to invite you, but we are poor people. We are Saidi, and we are simple people. And but my mother wants to know this white girl, which means a term not about the color of your skin, but that you speak Arabic and understand their culture, but you're not Arab or not Egyptian, and wants to meet this white girl who speaks Arabic. And I said, okay. So actually the next year that I went, my driver took me to their home, met with the family to be sure that they were okay, and then he left me there to spend the night with his family, and he would come for me the next day. So my young friend, he said to me, don't tell my mother you dance. I went, okay. So he said, if it comes up, maybe you can say Iraq Shabi, meaning, you know, just the common people dancing. But don't tell my mother you dance. I said, okay. So that night later, he and his brother had to leave to go help his uncle, and Mom and I were watching a movie, an Egyptian film on TV. And as soon as they left, she bolted the door and she pulled off her headscarf, her gab, turned on the music, and she starts dancing. And she and I together. And when we heard, and we were just having the best time. We heard the motorcycle coming back, and she turns the TV back on, puts her scarf on, and we sat down and watched the TV again. And she said to me, shh, don't tell him. You know? I said, okay. And this was a village where they had never seen an American, you know, and you think we're everywhere, but they had never seen an American live and in person. No one spoke any English, but they had satellite TVs everywhere. And it's probably one of those treasures. It's like, okay, I won't tell her that I dance, and I won't tell you that she dances either. So yes, very conservative. Yes, it depends. If you go into the Said, you're going to see mostly the men dancing. If you are in Alexandria, it depends on the time of year you're there. That's where I first worked as a dancer. And if you're working in the summer, the Saudis, the rich Saudis have summer homes there. The wealthy Egyptians have summer homes, and they come there for the summer, and things are, entertainment is stepped up a notch, and you're going to see glitz and glamour, and it's where most of the dancers working in Cairo will go for the summer, because it's only 112 degrees there. It's about 10 degrees cooler than in Cairo. Yeah. So it depends on where you go, okay, as to what you see. And whether you're in a hotel nightclub, or you're in a theater, or you're in a public nightclub, which is a much lower class setting. So, yes, so he was in the theater, which is like top of the heap, you know?
Mm-hmm. And, you know, you talked a little bit about Farida's family standing up to some of the flack they were getting. Were the dancers in his troupe seen as higher class or the same class as the Oriental dancers at the time?
It was a different class from Oriental dance, and I think this is an important distinction. When I first went to work in Egypt, Madame Aegela, who was my costume designer, God rest her, said to me, it's good you're dancing in five-star hotel. Okay, I accept this. She said, first, you never dance in a public nightclub. It's very bad, and not that they objected. They just don't want their wife, mother, sister, cousin, niece to be an Oriental dancer because they think they're around unsavory types. There's smoking, there's drinking in the clubs, in the nightclubs. But if you're in the theater setting, it's entirely different. It's a place where you can take your family, to go to. And so because the Reda Troupe was working in the theater, they were not a nightclub group, and it was always, the girls and boys were always chaperoned by some family member. And because somebody of his society standing, Hassan Fahmy, this gave a lot of credibility to what they were doing. They were being legitimate. So they really couldn't be compared to Oriental dancers in the same way. An Oriental dancer is mostly a soloist, and the Reda Troupe choreographies were all written for group use, not for soloists. Mm-hmm. So the attitude toward them was quite different, I think.
Gotcha. And, we've talked a little bit about this sense of representing Egypt and Egyptian identity. It sounds like the Egyptian people were largely on board with it, that they really did see this as something us. Is that accurate, or did the Egyptian people see this differently?
No, I think they were very on board with it, and I think it goes back to the point you made about the modernization sweeping Egypt back in the 50s when Reda was starting. Another point he did, another thing for his success, of course he was poor, and he said the reason I chose this man, he charged me only £1, and this I could afford, But he went to a composer that Ali Reda brought to him. The composer's name was Ali Ismail, who later was the primary composer for all of the music used by the Reda Troupe. But in his early salad days, Moody actually went to Ali's home, and he could sit there and wait for the music to be written. And he actually stayed with the composer to dance segments and to, he said, so there we are in his reception, and I am dancing and describing, and he's writing music, and the man he charges me £1, But what Ali Ismail did was to incorporate Western instruments in with traditional Egyptian instruments and music. And so it rather revolutionized or modernized the sound of Egyptian music at that time. And this was another thing. If you think that your general society is looking for modernization, then anything that's tangential to that, I think, becomes acceptable. And Gotcha. This was part of that dance process that was becoming acceptable. All these elements, and yet they were still chaperoning the boys and girls so that they acquiesced to that conservative mindset that wanted to function in a modern culture.
Well, you figure, the big stars now all have PR people managing their images, so why not?
Yeah, put a spin on it.
If you're on the Disney Channel, they're very careful about presenting you as fresh and wholesome, and then you turn 18 and go on MTV and everything changes.
Right. That's true. But in Egypt, I always said, you're judged as much for your conduct off stage as you are on stage. And as an Oriental dancer there, I could have easily, let me rephrase that before I get into hot water. It is possible for someone to be fined or have their license pulled for a while because of something they do in their personal life, but they could still have their professional license pulled at that time. And every time I would arrive there to go to work, when I'd fly into Egypt, one of the people in immigration would go, Madame, did you hear about so-and-so, this dancer? And I went, really? Oh, she beat this policeman with her shoe, okay? So that was way before YouTube and PR spins. All you had to do was tell an Egyptian, and it was all over, It ran like wildfire. So they were, your PR was a lot about your own doing in that time. That your conduct was very suspect, and if you're working as an Orientalist, I had 2 security guards with me all the time. And first I asked them why, the hotel manager, why. He said, oh, it is to protect you. But I think now it was probably just to protect Egypt from me. I'm not sure, but it's been pointed out before. So, in fact, I think Moody said that. He said they were protecting Egypt from you. So he...
Go ahead.
Go ahead. No,
go ahead. Please go ahead.
Oh, he was, in many of our conversations about that, about his coming up and the acceptance of what he did in Egypt. I think it was so crucial for people to know that always he was driven early on by the success of Egyptian dance. It was really not a personal quest. And yes, no one goes into the dance because they hate it, or no one spends so much time in it because, they find it boring. He's very artistic and very innovative. But I think I was always so touched that all these things that he wanted for Egypt. Mm-hmm. There's a huge amount of national pride.
Well, that's actually a great segue into my next question,
okay.
Which is, we talked a little bit about how Egyptians see his work. How do you think Americans and other Westerners see his work, and how much of that do you think is accurate? What misconceptions or, correct understandings are there?
Okay. This is something, let's dispel a few myths. People have often said to me, he hates Oriental dancing. It's like, he never said that. He's never said that. In fact, he came to see my show when I was working in Alex, and I was like blown away by that. And any time that I would go and take workshops with him in the U.S. or when I had him in Atlanta, and I would perform, he always made me feel that he was so proud of me. And he would come to the stage to help me down the steps, or he would make it a point to come and talk with me after. He was gracious to everyone. I never heard him say something really bad about anyone. If he had to be negative, he would say, well, maybe it could have been better, But he was so gracious in that, very patient, but his standards are very high. He understood the need for the dance to evolve. He, I think, understood the need that as a teacher, and I can say this about myself, it was always my goal to raise someone who would be a better dancer than I have been. And because, number one, I didn't have me. They had me, I had him. They had Reda. And as a teacher, when you really want to share it, it really is your hope that you will see somebody go further with it. Someone that you taught, that you touched, will go further with it than you did. And that's not threatening. People often think that, that people of his caliber or stars of his caliber never have to struggle with paying the rent, or that the money has always flowed in. I don't know what they think. Did he get out of bed one morning and go, and now I'm famous, send me money? But it's not true. And he was very caring, is very caring, and his curiosity about what other people are doing. He's fascinated. Sometimes when I would go to the studio, he would say, tell me about your choreography. And I go, really? Mine's nothing. I want to talk about yours. Tell me what you were doing. Tell me, how do you have this idea, So he is as down to earth. He's got a great sense of humor, but he's as down to earth as they come, and doesn't feel threatened. I don't think has ever felt threatened by someone else's work. And wouldn't it be wonderful if so many of us could have that attitude, you know, that we can rejoice in someone else's work and not feel that it has to be a one-way win, you know.
Mm-hmm.
He also, people would say, how can I get his choreographies? It's like, well, he never wrote any of them down. He's always been fascinated with photography and did all the photography for the group, and a few years back published a book of his work, finally. But he, where I was going, his intent really was to inspire somebody else and have them say to him how he inspired their work. You know, what did you learn from my work? He would say. I would sit there and watch DVDs with him so often and go, oh, look at this. And I said, and you turn this way and you do that and you do. He said, do I? Really? Oh, let me see, you know. It's like, yes, I think you're right. I do this. But he never wrote down any of his choreographies. Sometimes he would film them with his camera, with his little Super 8. And now he is actually digging up some of these old films, and he puts them on his iPad. So last year when I was there, he showed me his first choreography ever that he wrote. And can I tell you, it was, he said, what do you see? I said, not much. He said, exactly. I said, the boys were doing 3 steps, you know. And of course, Reda was beautiful as ever, but the boys were doing 3 steps in one direction, 3 steps in the other, and that was their whole choreography. And he said, you know, you work with what you have. And in the beginning, they were completely untrained. So while he wrote 150 plus choreographies in his time, he often went back and rewrote them as the skill level of his dance company improved. And haven't we done that too? You know, perhaps. I know. I started to having put version numbers on some of my choreography. Version 1, version 2, level 3, level, you know, so that, because he said, if you don't, you can become bored, you know. So, and I just love some of his theories on choreography. I said, how do you come up with these ideas? He said, make a problem. I said, no, I have enough of those. He says, yes, but make one for dancing, you know. And he said, if you make a problem and solve it, you have good choreography. But if you have no problem, you have only a normal dance.
That's interesting. Can you give us an example?
I said, so, like, what kind of problem? Like, I don't know the music or I don't know the rhythm. And he said, no, first we must know this. But he said, for instance, decide that you will have an uneven number of dancers in the piece. And how will you make this if so many go this way and so many go that way? Well, not be even, not be equal. Try to make one choreography going on within another choreography at the same time. I went, oh, okay, you know. And he said, or one of the exercises he would make me do sometimes is, he said, okay, I will give you this music, and you must do only these 3 moves. I went,
that is a thing that I do with my students all the time. Sorry, I didn't mean to make this about me, but that is one of my core improv series.
Isn't it great?
Awesome.
And it's one of the things I tell mine all the time. I said, you know, it's like, speed it up. Or, you know, if the music is fast, go slow. If it's slow, go faster. And he said one day, I remember when I was working in Egypt, and also when I would go there and spend summers sometime, I would go and take classes with him 3, 4, 5 days a week. And he never let me pay him for my private classes. He would say, okay, you have to take me to dinner. I'd say, okay, great. And then, of course, to go to dinner anywhere with him, nobody would ever bring him a check because he's Mahmoud Reda. And I'd say, you plan this? He said, yes, of course. So, but when I would study, he would say, okay, I give you this music, and you must do only 3 movements. Because in the West, people, they try to push everything they know in one piece, and then what for the next dance? And I went, oh, okay. And it's hard, you know, if you're limited. And then he kept cutting down the number of movements I could do. And he said, you think, do I do this right? Do I do this left? Do I do this reverse? Do I do fast? Do I do slow? And, you know, and he thought it was humorous to give me a piece of music that was 9 minutes long. And so do 3 moves. And another day I said, I think I would like to work on spins. Okay. It was June and it was 112 degrees in Cairo. And at the time, the studio, we had no air conditioning, and it was a 3rd floor walk up, still a 3rd floor walk up. Although they finally gave him an elevator to use for his personal use. But anyway, and he said, okay. So he had this big bottle of water, and he would say, touch my hand. He would put his hand out, and he said, as you turn, you must come around and, you know, brush my hand. I will hold my hand out to you. And I thought, well, okay, that's nice. But he kept moving around the room, and I would spin and I would get dizzy and I would fall down, and he would laugh, and he thought that was so funny. He would pour water on me. He'd say, get up, do it again. I didn't ask for spins anymore. And I tell my students, I said, be careful what you wish for. Mm-hmm. But he would, you know, it was to teach me to always be aware of where my space, you know, my space and where my audience, and to, it wasn't just about spotting because I knew how to spot, but he said always, you know, it's changing where you look so that you don't just look in one space, one spot. So I was very careful about what I asked for in the future. He did, as you know, as all of y'all know out there, his choreographies were written for groups. They weren't written for soloists, but I found it very interesting that many of the famous name Egyptian dancers, soloists, came to him to study. And he was a huge hit in the U.S., I can say. We had more than 120 people at seminars for him in Atlanta. And I think part of that reason that people were so intrigued by him is that he hears the breath in music, and he can dance the silence of it. He taught me to dance the silence, where in the West we were going 1, 2, 3, 4. He would teach you to dance between 4 and 1, for instance. But he would hear the breath, and something so beautiful about his dance is the fluidity and the grace, but it takes a lot of core strength and body strength to do it well. And his style, I think, can look beautiful on the soloist. It has elements for that can be used in tribal dance. I'm an Oriental dancer, a soloist by nature, but you know, I'm going to teach it to Sacred Circle, a tribal convention in October. I'm teaching Intro to Reda technique because it's a movement and traveling form. So I think even though people often say, oh, he's only for folklore, there's elements of him that translate to every genre.
Mm-hmm. Can you tell us a few of those stylistic elements that you think are particularly applicable?
Yes. I think, for instance, if you're working with groups, obviously it's about how you move people around the floor. It's a look at choreographing one soloist in the middle of a group dance. For instance, Reda was often doing her own solo spot, but it wasn't like all of the girls in the chorus backed up, you know. There was still an element going on behind her. It was the fluidity, the arms, the lift, the arabesque, the quick weight changes and turns that are so signature Reda. And I think even if you're doing folklore, it would be interesting. He would tell you, why is your foot in this position? You know, why, if you are doing something Saidi, is the foot a little more flat? Okay, because they wear shoes with no back. They're called shub-shub. And these shoes have no back, and if they point their toe, the shoe falls off. Okay, it's very bad for the choreography, he said. You know, so, but he loved the Saidi people. Even though we told a lot of Saidi jokes, he loved the Saidi people and found that there was so much power in their simplicity and so much joy in their music and passion in their dance. So I think he's most often associated with Saidi music and dance. But he took just everyday events. You know, he saw, for instance, the Tatib dance when people were, men were fighting like martial arts. And so he went to an instructor in Aswan, he tells the story, to learn to do this Tatib. How do you dance with this, you know, this stick that's like about shoulder height and probably about 2 inches in diameter. And he said at the end of the class, the teacher hit him really hard with the Tatib. And he said, first rule had been don't get hit, you know. And he said, why do you do this to me? Why did you do this? He said, because one day you're going to be famous and I want you to remember who I am. So maybe he had some rougher teachers too in his history, you know. But I feel like there's any element, I mean, whether you look at working with a group and how to make them more cohesive, how to interact, how to use the floor space. I think as a Western trained dancer, in my baby years, if I could have been lowered from the ceiling and dropped in the middle of the stage and done and then beam me up at the finish, you know, I was like terrified to leave my spot, my spot, my home spot, you know. And yet with him, I learned ways to travel and combinations to use, you know, to go from A to B on the stage. Yeah. So I think there's something in the Reda technique for every genre.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Now, you talked about some Oriental dancers going to study with him. I also understand that a lot of his troupe members went on to train Oriental dancers, and they include some pretty famous names.
Ra'ya Hassan, for one, yes. Randa Kamel was studied with him often, and I mean, we could list an endless list of people that, as I would sit in the studio, would come by to visit him or say hello to him. They were working on the dinner cruises in Egypt. They were working in the Mina House, the big hotel, the elegant big hotel out in Giza by the pyramids. Everyone, I think, all these Egyptian dancers were seeing the value of what training he had to offer. So Mohammed Hosseini, who's now living in Finland and training Reda technique there, training the men, for one. Saeed Ismail went on to, now lives in Italy and is training dancers there in Reda technique. So I think because of all the reasons we've just talked about, you know, the Egyptian dancers also recognized the value of his choreographic technique, his sense of timing, you know, in Egyptian music. And certainly anybody who tried to go to work in Egypt, and I say this of myself, the first night I opened, I asked for 4 songs, and it said after that, the next hour, I was hearing music I'd never heard before in the U.S., you know. So there's a way that you have to start to hear Egyptian music. Your mind has to open up and hear it differently than you do music in the West. There's a lot of passion and a lot of breath in Egyptian music, especially the classical music. And he's the one that can teach you. He was. He has since tells me he's not going to be touring anymore. And, you know, when I was interviewing him last year, we were sitting in his home, and his lovely wife, Rosa, who was a ballet dancer, his second wife. They've been together 51 years, get that plug for marriage. Yeah, I know. And she's a delightful lady. But we were sitting in his home, and, and I said to him, trials and tribulations of starting the group and then all the successes. And I said, and how do you want people to remember you? And my intent in that was, what is the thing that you would most like to be known for? But I think maybe in the translation, he turned the tables on me. He said, because I want you to teach Mahmoud Reda. And he's happy. I said, oh, there's so many people, wonderful dancers and young people. And he said, it's good, okay, if he's happy, if people say, and I learned this from Mahmoud Reda, but give him credit for that. But, he said to me, but I want you to do this. You understand my heart. You understand the heart of Egypt. And I think in that moment, I realized all the effort that he had put in to me and the patience that he had with my growth. Sorry, that's emotional. And he said, now you understand. And I said, yes. Yeah, I understand. The footage and of his personal, from his personal archives, and the music and the understanding, and the times that we would watch DVDs all night, and I know even back in the 90s, he taught a seminar in Tampa, Florida, and he said, yes, but I'll come, but you have to do Friday night. And I went, oh, okay. I think he believed in me a lot sooner than I believed in me, perhaps, for which I'm grateful. But we both have a passion for Egypt. Anyone who knows me knows that Egypt is like my second home, and I am just passionately concerned with what's going on there. With my life there, I feel completely at peace and at home when I'm in Egypt. And I think it also goes hand in hand with his feeling of his country. Mm-hmm. He understands my feeling for it. And also because we have to know who went before us. You said, what is the point in being different just to be different? If you're going to be different, you know where it comes from. First you understand the foundation, and then you have the right to be different, but not just to leap out there and go, oh, I'm going to do this with a beanie propeller on my head and 2 trash can lids on my feet. That's different. That's good. Okay, he says, if you know where it comes from. So I'm hoping as he digs more into, he has his time now. Traveling is very difficult for him because, his, like any of us as we progress, his knees bother him, his hips bother him. He's tired. He said, I want to be, Mahmoud Reda in Egypt and enjoy his time. But I'm also hoping that he will continue to pull together some of this footage, that's been buried in a Super 8 camera maybe for years, so that we can enjoy it. I told him once in Atlanta, it was more than 20 years ago, as we stood on the stage, I said, when my last day in dance comes, you will be my greatest memory. And he said, why you do this to me? Now you make me cry in front of all these people. But he would still ask me, I am still your great memory? I said, yes, of course, you're still my greatest memory, for the friendship and the encouragement. And if anything, for me, one day when I do decide to retire, which I can't really see that happening, but should it happen, I would like to have achieved the grace and the and have raised students who have gone on to achieve greater things than I could even imagine, because I was inspired by him.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
That's almost going to make me cry.
Oh,
in a good way.
yeah.
In a good way.
Well, I'll tell you something fun. He had such a great sense of humor, and he was honored at the second International Conference on Belly Dance, and I was out in Orange County, and I was out there to see him, and I had front row seats, and he always would say often he would come to Atlanta and stay at my house between his cities in the U.S. tours. He would say, can I come? And I go, well, certainly, because he would be put into a hotel, they'd do the weekend, and then he was kind of left on his own, and he had to pay for that week out of his own pocket before he went to the next city. So he would say, can I come to Atlanta? And I'd say, well, of course you can. He said, okay, I have my ticket. So he'd already buy his ticket. And he said, can I have my room? And I said, yes, of course you can. And so he would come and stay at my house and, spend the week. And then I would get him to the airport for his next stop, And sometimes I would plan outings for him. And he would always say, do I have to wear a jacket? I said, there's such a fashion plate. Do I have to wear a jacket? Yes, no, yes, no. Okay. So he's at the conference, and I'm sitting down in the front row, and he looks down, and he shielded his eyes from the lights, and he's waving to me. He's on stage being honored. He's kind of waving. And he raised his right foot, and he was wearing red sneakers, red Keds. Because I said, why you do this? And a jacket. He said, I was nervous. And so if he could look down and see his red shoes, it would make him laugh. So.
I have to ask you about how you met and how you ended up working with him so closely.
Oh, well. I went to Egypt in 1983. Auntie Rocky was your guest last month, and I went on a trip with Morocco's group when she was running those, and it was one of the first times I'd actually been out of the U.S., and this man came to the Victoria Hotel where the group was staying to teach us to have a folkloric class. And this was in 1983, and I was a Southern girl, and we didn't know folkloric from Shinoa, honey. I mean, everything for us was, big hair, long nails, sequins and glitter. We didn't know from folkloric. And I remember going, what's that about? But I was really touched more about the man than I was even about what he was teaching. And probably to this day I couldn't remember much of what we did do. There were 45 of us in that group. But I remember he was so very modest, so gracious, so patient. He stood for every photograph. He signed every request. He answered all the questions. And in all the many years I have known him since then, he's still that person. For all that he's achieved, all that he's accomplished, he's still that gracious, modest man who's curious about the other person. The following year I went back to Egypt, and in 1985 I was hired there, which is kind of another Cinderella story for later, but I was hired to come to work in Alexandria, and I went earlier that year, a few months before, to deal with a few things, and I had this card from this man, who was on Qasr O'Neill, and I knew that there were a lot of famous shoe stores on that street. And everything in Egypt is done by streets: car street, shoe street, dress street, And I thought, what can it hurt? And I probably wouldn't have the courage to do this now, but I was naive enough then to just simply take his business card, hand it to a taxi driver, and find the place. And I think I knocked on his studio door. just right out of the blue. And today I would never be so presumptuous to do that. But I was a baby dancer, and I wanted to meet this man and see if I could take classes with him. Because in those 2 years ensuing, we had begun to see some folkloric representation in the South. Mm-hmm. And it was like, sometimes you don't quite see the gift that's given to you when you first receive it, but you have to process it. And I started going, he graciously let me in, and it's like, and we talked, and I asked to take a class, and I went back, and even then, he never took my money. But maybe he saw a naive baby dancer that was coming from out of the country to work in Egypt, and that was still fairly novel at that time. And I then, as he started coming to the U.S., I went to every workshop that he was teaching that I could possibly get to. And I think the friendship just grew from there. I was interested in him, fascinated by his mindset, by the way he thinks. And for me, it was more about getting to understand how the artist thought than it was about, being around the artist, I wanted to know the person who was the artist. And he graciously let me into that world. He would, when I would go to the Balloon Theater, he would let me sit there and watch while he worked on the lighting board for the shows. He would let me into, I rehearsed with the company. I went to ballet class 3 times a week, just like everybody else had to, and he would tell me some of the greatest stories. And then as he came to Atlanta, I have to tell you this one story. One of the outings I arranged for him was to go to the museum. He wanted to see dinosaurs. We laughed and said we wanted to see something older than us. And so there was a dinosaur exhibit at Fernbank Museum, and I took him there one morning. And then we stopped at a Lebanese deli in downtown. I thought that would be in that area of town. It would be nice for him, food that he could recognize, and I was a terrible cook anyway. And they started playing some of his music in the restaurant. We were the only people there. And the owner came out to ask about how the food, and I said, oh, great. And I said, and this music is so-and-so, Mr. Mahmoud Reda. He said, yes, of course. And I said, and this is Mr. Mahmoud Reda. And he laughed at us. And I was just shocked and appalled. I said, and I said, no, really, this is the famous Mr. Mahmoud Reda. He said, yeah, like the famous Mr. Mahmoud Reda will walk into my sandwich shop, and he walked out, And I was so embarrassed. How can I bring this celebrity to my hometown and not even the Arab, someone in the Arab community would, not recognize or not believe. He thought that was so funny. He loved it. He said, yeah, who is Mahmoud Reda? So yes, he was never full of himself.
That's just so funny.
I know.
I think that's actually a great place to start bringing this to an end. I can't believe it, but it's been an hour and 15 minutes
I know.
already.
I just looked. It's like, oh my God.
I could listen for another hour, but I know people have things to
honey,
do,
I could talk about him for days and tell you stories. But
oh yeah.
But thank you so much for letting me talk with you today, and for the kind people who have been listening in. Thank you.
My pleasure. Well, so we're going to take some questions and answers before we have to go.
Sure.
So I do have a couple of final questions for Aegela, but in the meantime, folks who are listening, if you have a question and you're on the webcast, you can type that in the Submit Your Question box on the left-hand side of your screen. And those of you who are on the call by phone or Skype, you can press *2 to raise your hand, So if you're on a regular phone, that's *2 on your phone. And if you're on Skype, that's *2 on the Skype keypad, not necessarily *2 on your keyboard. Okay, and while we're waiting for those to come in, Aegela, so if people take one thing away from this call, what would you want that to be?
One thing is that he's been through the same struggles that we have. He's known budget problems, rehearsal hall problems, commitment level from troupe members, having to retrain. The young girls would get married, go off, have their families. The troupe would have to rebuild. He's experienced all of that, just like we have. He didn't just get up one morning and he was famous because he was Mahmoud Reda. But he understands the difficulties facing dancers and applauds their efforts to build within their communities. I would like for people to know him as the person that I know. He is somebody that I would choose as my friend even if he were not famous. I would choose him first as my friend, secondly, because he's an artist.
Mm-hmm. And if people want to learn more, what's the best way for them to do that?
Call us. Write us. Aegela.com, AEGELA.com. We are now booking for a lot of seminars. We just did one in Pittsburgh and one in Washington, D.C., about introduction to the Reda technique, which includes some film footage and some history, and then lots and lots of time of Reda-inspired combinations that have been, as my dancers say, Aegela-sized. But, yes, Aegela.com, AEGELA.com.
Mm-hmm. And it sounds like you're willing to travel and people can come and see you in Toledo?
Yes, they can come and study with me at my studio in Toledo. We can house them. We can come to you. And actually, some people say, well, if I get enough people together, sometimes the smaller groups, like about 10 people, it's a wonderful group to work with because working his choreography, his combinations takes some space. And I would rather work with even 10 people who have a real burning desire to understand and to know him, than 40 or 50. Not that we're opposed to 40 or 50 either, but it's really wonderful to work in a small group where you really get to understand him, the technique, and start applying it to your own genre.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Excellent. All right. So it looks like we have some comments in the webcast. Again, if anybody's on the phone and wants to type in wants to pose a question, you can press *2 to raise your hand. And on the webcast, we have Basima in Potsdam saying, "Love you, Aegela."
I love you too, Basima. Hi.
And Jamina in Pittsburgh says, "Wonderful stories, always, Aegela. Thank you. XOXO."
Oh, love her too. Jamina's one that put together our last event in Pittsburgh. Yeah.
Excellent. And then Pauline in Montreal says, "No specific question, just would like to have a long discussion with you about him. Thank you so much to have shared this knowledge."
Oh, thank you. I'd love to meet her or talk with her and know how she might know what she knows about the Reda technique and the Reda process.
Excellent. And then Sharifa Asmara in North Carolina says, "Hi, Aegela, love you."
Hi, Sharifa. Love you too. Been too long.
Okay, and I'm not seeing any hands raised on the phone lines. Let me do one last refresh on the webcast. Go ahead.
I will give you some advice. Don't let him cook for you. He's a worse cook than me. He almost blew up my microwave in Atlanta. He said, "I made tea for you. I think it's a little done." It looked like a charcoal briquette.
Well, you should all come to Boston because I'm a good cook.
All right, we can do that. I'm a terrible cook. He would always, every time I go to the studio, he has for me spaghetti. I said, "You know how to cook the same thing I know. We can, it's okay." But and I did come home one day. He was in Atlanta, and I had an accounting practice at the time that I went out. And I came back, and I said, "Minnie, where are you?" I thought maybe he was upstairs in my rehearsal room working or something. "I am in this room at the bottom," he said, and I went down, and he was sorting my laundry. I said, okay, that's enough. What are you doing? He said, I saw the servants do this once. And I said, I am not telling people Mahmoud Reda was doing my laundry. Of course, I just did. But I said, this is too embarrassing. I said, can't you just sit down and be famous or something? So, keep him away from your microwave.
And it looks like we have one last comment. This is from Jamina again, who says, the Reda Intensive is fantastic. We all took away so much from the weekend and are looking forward to the next level. Highly recommend it to all.
Thank you so much.
Oh, nice.
You're an awesome group of dancers there, too. Woohoo, just saying. And thank you, my dear, for this time with you.
Oh, well, thank you so much. This has been fantastic, and thank you so much for making time on a holiday, especially.
I've looked forward to it, and I've been so nervous about it, and you were very kind to me.
Oh, you made it so easy. And thank you, everybody, for coming. I'm really glad that so many of you could show up. And this is the end of our call, but that doesn't mean that the conversation has to end. We have a private Facebook group just for Clubhouse listeners. So if you're on the Clubhouse mailing list, you'll get an email shortly, which will include an invitation to that group. So we can keep talking about all of this and sharing resources and posting YouTube links and keep all this good stuff going. And in that email, I'll also include a link to the call recording. So if you want to listen to this again, you can do that. As well as, now, Aegela mentioned a couple of movies that he's featured in, so I'll try and include those titles as well in the show notes. So if you want to go off and find them, you can see some of that work. Also in the email will be a link to my Clubhouse survey, because I'd really like to get some of your feedback on this. You know, I organize the Clubhouse, but really it's for all of us. So I'd like to know what topics and speakers you'd like to see or any improvements that I can make. Our next call for March is not scheduled yet, and I don't have final confirmation, so I'm not going to tell you what it's about, but you're going to like it. And the last thing that I want to say is that the Clubhouse is the come-on-in kind of Clubhouse, not the no boys allowed kind. So if you know anybody who would enjoy geeking out with us, you can invite them to join us at bellydancegeek.com/clubhouse. And until next time, happy dancing. Good night, everybody.
Thanks for listening. For more geek-tacular resources, visit bellydancegeek.com.